Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that digs into stacks of fascinating sources, pulls out those key insights, and basically gives you a shortcut to getting really well informed on some complex topics.
Mhm.
And today, wow, we're embarking on this journey through the incredible, often sort of invisible power of sound.
Yeah, it really is everywhere, but we don't always notice how it's working.
Exactly. And trust me, this deep dive is going to surprise you, I think, with just how broad it is. We're talking about a path that stretches all the way from those really pioneering, almost alien-sounding bleeps in early sci-fi films,
The real early stuff.
all the way to, well, the very intentional, intricate musical arguments that contemporary classical composers are making right now about, the biggest global issues we're facing, socio-political
It's
stuff.
a huge leap, but there's a definite through line there.
It really is a fascinating arc. It reveals just how profoundly sound shapes how we understand things, how it evokes emotion, and even how it becomes this, sophisticated language for really complex ideas. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Our mission today is basically to explore how music moves beyond just being background noise, how it evolves into this integral part of the story, not just on screen, but also in the very real world we live in.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is how we'll trace the evolution of this idea, this intentionality of sound. We'll start with those very first pioneering electronic sounds, the ones that gave voice to alien worlds and future technologies back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll dig into the sort of philosophical underpinnings of how music conveys meaning in film, that idea of it being like an invisible architect shaping the space.
I would love that metaphor.
Yeah, it's a good one. And finally, we'll see how modern composers are consciously really wielding music as this overt, powerful tool for social and political commentary.
Right.
So we're not just going to touch on what sounds do, but really delve into why they matter and sort of unpack the intricate mechanics of their impact. It reveals a level of, intentionality that goes far beyond what most of us probably consider when we just, listen to a film score or a piece of music.
Yeah, definitely expecting some aha moments today.
Oh, for sure. Get ready.
Okay, so let's kick off our journey in a really groundbreaking place. The beginning, the genesis of those alien soundscapes in film. Now, when you think electronic music, your mind probably jumps straight to, I don't know, Kraftwerk, or maybe 80s synth pop.
Yeah, that's the common association, right?
But the cinematic world was actually experimenting with electronic sounds years, even decades, before they really hit the mainstream music scene. We're talking about the experimental era of the 1950s. It was a time when even the most basic electronic music required just immense, almost unimaginable effort.
It really did. It wasn't like pressing buttons on a synth.
Not at all. Picture this. The legendary American composer John Cage and his collaborators back in 1953 spending 3 whole months painstakingly slicing, splicing, and rearranging tiny fragments of magnetic tape.
Wow.
Yeah, their goal, to create what was, at the time, this revolutionary, totally sampled track. And this wasn't about synthesizers like we know them today. It was all physical manipulation of recorded sound.
Okay.
Just gives you a real sense of the sheer, laborious dedication involved in early electronic sound creation.
Absolutely. A true craft. Patience and precision.
Meticulous precision.
It absolutely was.
Yeah.
And right in the middle of this, burgeoning era, 1956, comes this pivotal moment for film music, the release of Forbidden Planet.
Ah, yes, the classic.
A total classic. And this wasn't just another sci-fi film. It was the very first film to feature an entirely electronic soundtrack, a really bold move that honestly set a precedent that's still echoing through film scores today.
Who was behind that?
The composers were a married couple, Louis and Bebe Barron. They were already pretty immersed in the whole avant-garde electronic music scene at the time. And their compositional process was incredibly unique, really pioneering for its time, and just delightfully unconventional.
How so? What did they do?
Well, they didn't use traditional instruments or orchestras at all. Instead, they literally used a wedding gift, a state-of-the-art tape recorder back then, to manipulate recordings of just everyday noises.
Seriously? Like what?
Yeah. Imagine them capturing the sound of bubbling liquids or pipes clanking or even just pure static.
Right.
And then applying all these experimental effects like reverb, echo, various kinds of distortion. They were essentially creating their own sound library from scratch, transforming these ordinary sounds into something utterly new, otherworldly, and crucially, distinctly alien.
Wow.
And the result was, well, It was far from melodic in any traditional sense. Critics described it as bleeps and whirring, a flood of haunting tones, sirens, and alien noises. These weren't, pleasant, hummable tunes. It was this sonic tapestry that felt distinctly unnatural, unsettling, and just perfectly suited to the unknown of space.
So it wasn't just a stylistic choice they made in isolation. It was really tied into the whole cultural vibe at the time, right? The zeitgeist.
Precisely. This wasn't just the Barrons working in a vacuum with their unique artistic vision. It was deeply connected to the broader cultural context of the 1950s and 60s. Remember, this was the peak of the space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Right. Huge deal.
Huge. The public's imagination was totally captivated by the idea of outer space, new frontiers, futuristic technology. And what did this technology look like back then? Think of those sprawling, room-filling mainframe computers.
Oh, yeah, the giant ones with all the flashing lights.
Exactly. The complex circuits, the humming machinery, the telemetry signals coming back from early satellites. These were the visual and sonic cues of progress, but also of the unknown. And early electronic instruments, with their banks of wires, knobs, flashing lights, they resonated really strongly with this public perception of outer space-like technology.
Okay, I can see that connection.
Yeah, and as the documentary Kraftwerk and the Electronic Revolution points out, even the experimental composers of the time, they recognized this connection. They often discussed this direct link between the look and the sound of their electronic gear and these futuristic, cosmic themes that were just everywhere in society. The sound itself became this tangible, audible manifestation of the future.
It's fascinating how quickly that link formed, almost like electronic sound was just inherently destined for science fiction. The legendary sound designer Ben Burtt, Star Wars, Indiana Jones fame, he famously observed that electronic music is fundamentally part of science fiction's language.
Yeah, it's a great quote.
And when you really stop and think about why that connection is so strong, it makes total sense, doesn't it? There's something inherent in that electronic soundscape, isn't there, that perfectly conveys that deep sense of loneliness you might feel drifting through the vastness of space.
Definitely. That coldness, maybe?
Yeah, the often sparse, echoing, kind of detached nature of those early electronic sounds can evoke a profound sense of isolation, and it's also incredibly effective at communicating the foreignness, the mystery of alien worlds. Those unusual bleeps, the unsettling whirs, those disembodied tones, they instantly cue your brain, don't they, to understand that what you're seeing and hearing is not of this earth. It creates this atmosphere of the unknown, of something fundamentally different from our natural world.
You're absolutely right. It's a really powerful and pervasive tendency that has, largely defined the genre's sonic identity for decades now. However, it's also important to add a bit of nuance to Burt's observation. While electronic sounds certainly define a huge chunk of sci-fi's sonic identity, some of the most, moving and intriguing science fiction music actually has a more classical bent.
Ah, okay. Like what?
Well, think about the iconic scores for films like Stanley Kubrick's 2001. A Space Odyssey famously used classical pieces by Richard Strauss and György Ligeti to evoke that grandeur and mystery of space. Absolutely unforgettable.
True, yeah. That wasn't electronic at all.
Not at all. Or think more recently, these sweeping, really emotional scores for films like AI or Prometheus. Even the beloved Mass Effect 2 and 3 video games, which rely very heavily on orchestral arrangement to get that epic emotional feel.
Right, those are great examples.
So these examples clearly show it's not like a hard and fast rule that sci-fi must use only electronic music to be effective. It's a strong tendency, but not the only way.
So while those electronic sounds were definitely groundbreaking, they weren't the only way composers could convey that feeling of the future or the alien.
Exactly. The prevalence of electronic sound in early sci-fi wasn't just a singular creative choice, though it was that too. It was also an echo of the technological advancements and those futuristic aspirations that really defined that era. The very sound of electronic music, often cold, precise, synthetic, became kind of inextricably linked to the machine age, to computers, to space travel and the public mind. It truly permeated and helped define the atmosphere of science fiction back then, setting this powerful precedent for how the future might sound, and this subtle yet really profound way that music shapes our experience.
Well, it leads us nicely into considering how film music, regardless of whether it's electronic or orchestral, acts as this fundamental part of the whole cinematic experience. Much like something else we interact with every day but rarely think about in this way, architecture.
Architecture. Okay, intriguing.
Yeah. It's not just a backdrop. It's part of the very structure of how we perceive things.
I really love this idea of film music as architecture. It's a metaphor proposed by the scholar Tucker, and it's brilliant. To really get it, I want you, the listener, to just pause for a second. Think about how the fundamental design of a room affects your experience in it. Think about the feeling you get walking into, say, a grand echoing cathedral with towering ceilings and stained glass, versus stepping into a cramped utilitarian office space. Low ceilings, fluorescent lights.
Big difference. Huge difference. Even if they're both just rooms. The feeling they evoke, the way they make you move, the stories they seem to contain, the expectations they set, they're vastly different, right?
Totally.
So Tucker's metaphor isn't about the literal structure of a film, like, the editing or the script. It's about how the design of the film, specifically the music, shapes the feeling and the story within that cinematic space.
That's the absolute key.
Yeah.
Imagine three completely different interior spaces.
Yeah.
Let's say they're all photographed from basically the same camera angles, so you're just focused on the design of the room itself.
Okay.
One might be a cozy, dimly lit study, bookshelves, maybe a crackling fireplace. Another could be a stark, minimalist, modern apartment, exposed concrete, sharp lines. And a third, maybe the lavish, ornate ballroom, gilded mirrors, chandeliers, the whole 9 yards.
Got it. Through very different vibes.
Exactly. Even without seeing anyone do anything, each space would inherently produce a different feeling and imply different narratives, wouldn't it? You could easily imagine a really tense father-son argument playing out in that minimalist apartment, the harsh angles almost amplifying the emotional friction.
Yeah, I can see that.
Or a romantic first kiss unfolding beautifully in the ornate ballroom, the grandeur adding to the weight of the moment. Or maybe even a mysterious burglary happening in the cozy study, the shadows and cluttered shelves creating this atmosphere of intrigue. The design of the space itself just inherently conveys meaning and implies different stories, subtly guiding your expectations.
And so the analogy is that film music does the exact same thing, but invisibly. We don't see it, but we feel its effect.
Precisely, and that's exactly how this architectural analogy applies so well to film music. It makes something that feels abstract, quite concrete. Think about it. If you had the exact same conversation, same words, same literal denotative meaning happening in each of those three rooms, the connotative meanings, the underlying feelings, the intentions, the implications would subtly shift based on the context of the room, wouldn't they? The minimalist room might make the conversation feel colder, more direct, maybe even hostile. The ballroom might make it feel more formal or perhaps ironically trivial in such a grand setting.
Except
Film music operates in much the same way. It isn't merely an add-on designed to just, dress up a film or provide a simple backdrop, although sometimes it might feel like that. Instead, film music is an integral part of how a film as a whole conveys its meaning. It actively colors that narrative like a painter, adding emotional tones, and it provides crucial context for the descriptive, interpretive, and evaluative processes that your brain is doing constantly as you piece together the film's story.
wow.
It's a fundamental layer of communication, often operating below our conscious awareness, but incredibly impactful.
That brings up such a fascinating point about the unique nature of film music. It's typically non-diegetic. Now, for listeners maybe unfamiliar with that term, it just means it's not actually part of the story world itself. The characters usually can't hear it. It exists outside their reality, purely for our benefit as the audience.
Right, it's for us.
And of course, it's non-visual. You can't see it. So how can something that's not really in the story and that you can't even see have such a profound, undeniable impact on how you experience that story? It's almost like the film's mise en scène,
Explain that a bit.
Well, that's everything you see on screen, right? The deliberate choice of a dimly lit, dusty room or the character's worn-out clothes. Just as these visual cues subtly guide your feelings and expectations about the story, music does the same thing, but invisibly. It provides this set of subtle codes that guide your interpretation. Sometimes they support the filmmaker's intentions, and sometimes, maybe even more interestingly, they can work counter to them, adding layers of irony or complexity that only the audience picks up on.
You're hitting on the absolute core of its power there. Beyond just cueing you to think, oh, this scene is romantic or this is frightening, music impacts the overall sense of a film, including its time period or even its genre.
How so?
Well, for example, a sweeping orchestral score with grand melodies. It instantly transports you to a historical drama. While a pulsating, synth-heavy score, that firmly places you in a gritty, futuristic thriller. It's like a powerful, almost subliminal time and genre stamp.
Okay, yeah.
And this architectural role means it's not just about the emotional overlay. The core idea here, and this is really powerful for you as a listener to grasp, is change the music and you affect the story.
Fundamentally.
Fundamentally. Imagine a tense chase scene in an action film. Score it with fast-pounding electronic beats, sharp, dissonant strings. You feel the urgency, the danger, right?
Totally. Heart races.
But what if you scored that exact same visual sequence with, say, a whimsical, lighthearted jazz tune? Suddenly the chase transforms. It's not a desperate flight anymore. It's almost a comedic romp, despite the visuals being identical.
That's a great illustration.
It really shows the profound, if often subtle, role of music in shaping our perception of cinematic narratives. It completely redefines the emotional and narrative space. And this metaphorical understanding, thinking of music as architecture, really helps us appreciate the ongoing evolution and even the debates happening within film music itself, particularly that shift or perceived shift between classical and electronic approaches. Which brings us right to the contemporary landscape of film scoring and the sort of fascinating pendulum swing we seem to be witnessing right now.
Right. Let's talk about the contemporary soundscape of movie soundtracks, because there's definitely this widely observed trend. You see it discussed a lot online among film fans, that film music is shifting away from classical influence.
You hear that a lot.
Yeah, you often hear it debated in forums, with some users even saying things like they're sick of it, voicing the strong desire for the return of those grand, sweeping orchestral scores of the past. It's almost a nostalgic thing, a longing for a certain epic sound.
There's definitely a nostalgia factor.
But it's worth putting it in historical perspective. Like one of our sources points out, orchestral scores also fell out of favor in the 60s and 70s, then came back. Fashions come and go.
That's a really important point. It's cyclical.
It really seems like there's this cyclical nature to these trends, almost like a pendulum swinging back and forth between different dominant styles. What's popular today might just be another phase in this long history of musical evolution in film.
Indeed. And there are some very practical realities influencing these shifts that go beyond just audience preference or, a simple change in artistic taste.
But like what?
Well, one major factor is simply time constraints. Composers are often given incredibly tight deadlines, sometimes only getting a couple weeks to complete an entire score from start to finish.
Wow, that's fast.
It's incredibly fast.
Right.
And that makes it incredibly tough to write, orchestrate, record, and produce a complex, multi-layered score using real instruments, large ensembles, or a full orchestra within such a short time. It's often not logistically feasible for many projects. It is worth noting, though, that some reports suggest streamers, Netflix, Amazon, etc., are actually getting better at giving composers the time they need for their original movies and shows, which is a positive development, potentially leading to richer scores there.
So it's not always purely an artistic choice then. It can be dictated by the production schedule.
To a significant degree, yes. And then, of course, there are the financial considerations, where, frankly, in Hollywood, money wins over artistic work quite often.
It's unsurprising, maybe.
Perhaps not. The economic pressures are immense, and an orchestral score can be significantly more expensive to produce than an electronic one. You've got studio costs, musician fees, the sheer logistics involved. It adds up fast.
Sure.
Consider the interesting example of Joe Kramer. He delivered this really fantastic score for Mission Impossible: Rogue Nation back in 2015. Widely praised, very traditional orchestral grandeur, memorable themes, really echoing classic Hollywood scores.
I remember that score. It was great.
It was. Yet despite that success, he has apparently struggled since then to attract major high-profile projects. And in his own words, this might be because he prefers cherry-picking projects he really likes and gets genuine artistic value from, rather than treating it as a job like any other without asking questions.
Interesting perspective. Yeah.
And he contrasts this with what he calls Zimmer-affiliated composers, a group of highly prolific composers like Lauren Belf, Steve Jablonsky, Benjamin Wallfish, who often work in a similar aesthetic and produce a very high output. Now, while Kramer sort of implies they don't always prioritize artistic quality over quantity, it really must be said that some of these composers, like Wallfish for Shazam or Cure for Wellness, have delivered genuinely excellent and artistically resonant scores within that high-volume model. So, it's a complex landscape. Art meets commerce, always.
That's a really insightful look at the industry mechanics, and it also challenges that direct, maybe overly simplistic classical versus electronic dichotomy we hear so much.
Yeah.
Perhaps the shift isn't necessarily away from classical influence entirely.
Right.
But maybe more specifically, away from grandiose and orchestra-heavy styles.
That feels more accurate.
Yeah, like take Mica Levi. Known for her really unique, often unsettling scores for films like Under the Skin or Jackie. Her compositions are often minimalist, experimental, incredibly effective. But they sound very different from a traditional John Williams score.
Completely different world.
Right, yet they're considered more in line with the latest developments in the modern classical world, drawing on experimental techniques rather than, say, grand romanticism. And it's not like electronic elements are totally new to big film schools either. Jerry Goldsmith, Titan, Planet of the Apes, Alien, countless others.
Absolute legend. He was one of the first big composers to really integrate synthesizers and electronics into his major works. His score for Star Trek. The motion picture in 1979 is a prime example. He famously used electronic sounds for the enigmatic V'ger themes, incorporated synths into the driving Klingon theme, proving that this integration of electronic and orchestral sounds has a rich history in major Hollywood productions, long before it became, the hot new trend.
That's a crucial distinction to make. When we talk about classical influence in modern film scoring, it's not just about the instruments being used, it's often about the way they are used, the underlying compositional principles, the structural approaches.
Okay.
There's a distinct Williams sound, right?
Huh.
Characterized by incredibly complex, often handwritten themes, rich counterpoint, soaring melodies. It clearly harks back to the Romantic era of classical music, versus, say, a Glass sound, referencing Philip Glass.
Right, minimalism.
Exactly. Which relies on repetitive structures, often arpeggiated figures, slow harmonic changes. And that's true whether it's played by an orchestra or a synthesizer. The underlying approach is different. And many contemporary directors, from Ridley Scott talking to Hans Zimmer himself, they explicitly request, don't write me a symphony.
Okay.
They're actively seeking unique, groundbreaking sounds that push boundaries, create fresh sonic identities, rather than just adhering to traditional orchestral grandeur or familiar tropes. And it's also important to recognize that even those composers who sound like Hans Zimmer, the ones leaning into that powerful, percussive, synth hybrid sound, they are most certainly influenced by the masters like Bach, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky. Well, they grew up listening to these works. They studied their harmony, their form, their emotional depth. It's ingrained in their musical DNA, It just means their current projects maybe don't always budget for, or the director doesn't explicitly request, the rich, expansive sounds of, say, an Ennio Morricone or a Bernard Herrmann. The sonic landscape is just constantly evolving, driven by both creative desires and new technological possibilities.
Absolutely. And this evolution means embracing the really exciting possibilities that synthesizers and electric music offer, defining what many people consider the modern era of film scoring. Think about the bold, bizarre uniqueness of Stranger Things' completely synthesized score by Kyle Dixon and Michael Stein.
Instantly recognizable.
Totally. It's a pure throwback to 80s synthwave, immerses you instantly in that retro-futuristic vibe. Now, some critics might view it as maybe a weak facsimile, lacking deep thematic storytelling beyond simple textures for antagonists.
I've heard that criticism.
But others praise its subtlety and point to instantly memorable, iconic themes like that haunting arpeggiated motif for the Upside Down. It's become globally recognizable.
It really has.
Then you have these brilliant hybrid approaches, like Jeff Russo, who writes masterfully across genres and instruments. He combines orchestral and electric sounds in shows like Legion, creating this truly mind-bending, surreal soundscape that perfectly matches the show's experimental visuals.
Legion had amazing music.
So good. And Ramin Djawadi does similar masterful work for Westworld, blending like Western twang with electronic pulses and haunting orchestral melodies, all while still creating fresh, vibrant, and incredibly powerful traditional orchestral music for blockbusters like Game of Thrones, which, by the way, got millions of listens from people who might not normally listen to soundtracks.
Huge crossover hit.
Yeah. And other great examples of successful modern synth or hybrid scores. The dark, unsettling soundscapes of Mr. Robot, the epic electronic swells in Aquaman, the pioneering electropop of Tron, parts of Thor Ragnarok. The debate continues, sure, with some arguing these modern synth scores sacrifice musical storytelling depth, but regardless, the sheer diversity and innovation in the current soundscape is just incredibly exciting.
Precisely. What we've maybe come to think of as the classical sound is fading in some contexts, as the dominant mode, perhaps. But it doesn't mean the end of great music or even the end of orchestral music at all.
Not at all.
On the contrary, we really must embrace new ideas and enjoy the wonderful, exciting things now available to us musically.
Oh, right.
There's still fantastic orchestral music being made today. Think of scores like Dune or The Batman. But there are also numerous new styles of sound being experimented with, sounds humans have literally never heard before.
Yeah.
Technology hasn't just enabled these new sonic palettes, it also makes it incredibly accessible to listen to our favorite classical pieces over and over on amazing sound systems or discover obscure historical recordings online.
Right.
So in many ways, it truly is a great time to be a fan of orchestra, film music, and music in general.
That's a great way to put it.
And if music can shape our experience of fictional worlds so profoundly, well, that raises an important and pretty provocative question. Can it also be a direct voice, an intentional medium for the very real socio-political landscapes we inhabit?
That is the perfect segue into our next deep dive. Music as a vessel for overt socio-political commentary, specifically in contemporary classical composition. We're looking at some fascinating, really cutting-edge research by Nicholas Olson here. He specifically investigated how contemporary classical composition can explore these global socio-political issues, not just subtly, but with direct, intentional messaging.
Right, moving beyond just evoking a mood.
Exactly. Olson's research focused on a very specific and, let's face it, tumultuous period, 2019 to 2024. It encompasses this wide range of significant global events that touch nearly everyone. We're talking about the UK formally leaving the European Union, Brexit, and all its complex fallout. The profound, pervasive impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, its social and political aftershocks, our ongoing urgent attempts to grapple with climate change and its escalating effects, the shifting dynamics of American politics, the devastating Middle East crisis, and those pervasive, often divisive culture wars.
A heavy period.
A very heavy period. And after this extensive exploration done through his own compositions and analysis, Olson concluded that composition can indeed be successfully used as a vessel to explore global socio-political issues in a clear and compelling way.
It's a really compelling conclusion, particularly because it dives right into a long-standing debate in music philosophy. To really grasp its significance, it's helpful to put it in historical and philosophical context, especially regarding what's called referential music, music that explicitly refers to non-musical ideas or concepts.
Okay.
Interestingly, not all composers have agreed that music can even express specific external meanings. Igor Stravinsky, for one, held a really strong counter-argument. He famously wrote that music is, by its very nature, essentially powerless to express anything at all. This is only an illusion.
Wow, really? Powerless.
That was his view. He believed that any perceived expression, like sadness or joy, is merely an additional attribute that we as listeners thrust upon it by, as he put it, tacit and inveterate agreement as a society. He'd argue, for instance, that if J.S. Bach's music feels so deeply imbued with his religion, making him revered as the fifth evangelist, Stravinsky would say it's due to the context hearing it in church or the accompanying religious text, not the notes themselves having inherent theological meaning. The notes are just notes.
So he thought the meaning was entirely in the listener's head or maybe in the surrounding elements, but not actually in the music itself.
Precisely. For Stravinsky, the music itself was this abstract arrangement of sounds. Beautiful, moving, perhaps, but not a direct conveyor of specific external concepts. However, history provides numerous counterexamples that really challenge Stravinsky's rather strict view.
Okay, like who?
Well, take Bach himself.
Right.
While Stravinsky might disagree, many listeners and scholars have felt his music was so imbued with his religion that it transcended mere sound. The discussion then becomes, okay, is the religious sentiment inherent in the notes, or is it solely derived from context or the listener's knowledge? It's debatable. But a more direct example, look at the early 20th century English composer Ralph Vaughan Williams. His music is often described as saturated with the English people. He drew heavily from English folk music, not just for melodic inspiration, but as a deliberate act of embedding national identity. He uses quotation and allusion, direct musical snippets or subtle references to folk tunes that inherently bring with them histories, cultural significance, and references that are undeniably part of the music itself. It evokes a sense of English landscape or identity very directly for those who know the references.
Right, the reference carries the meaning.
Exactly. Then there's the Dutch composer Louis Andriessens' monumental work from 1989, De Materie, which means matter. He deliberately referenced non-musical ideas in his compositional process for each of its four movements, building philosophical and historical concepts directly into the musical fabric.
How did he do that?
Well, for instance, the first movement explicitly recalls shipbuilding in the Dutch Empire. This is reflected through continuous repetitions of loud, large chords that mimic the rhythmic hammering and the immense scale of shipbuilding. The second movement uses a structural device mirroring the architectural plan of Reims Cathedral, literally translating visual space into musical form. The third movement explores the Dutch de Stijl art movement by using sections of the orchestra as musical equivalents of Piet Mondrian's primary colors and geometric forms. He also drew from concepts of memory and time philosophy. This predetermined referential process explicitly connects the music to external concepts, proving a conscious effort to embed non-musical meaning.
That's incredibly deliberate.
Very. And similarly, the contemporary Scottish composer James Macmillan frequently uses referential devices related to extra musical elements. He has pieces drawing on poetry about Scottish markets, or his powerful work, Seven Last Words from the Cross, where the music directly reflects the text and emotional arc of Christ's final statements. He even has pieces referring to specific historical events, like the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. So Olson's research isn't really about proving music can mean something that debate has existed for ages in musicology. It's more focused on the practical application of reference in the compositional process, showing how composers are intentionally and systematically embedding meaning to convey specific socio-political commentary today.
Right, that distinction is crucial. It's about the how. And what Olson did was develop this practical toolkit of rhetorical devices. Now, for listeners, rhetorical devices are things traditionally used in speech writing, in literature, to convince others or to color the language of argumentation.
Like persuasive techniques.
Exactly. Think of a politician using a specific turn of phrase to rally support, or an author creating suspense. And it's important to remember, Olson points out, this need not be intentional deception, but rather they're highly persuasive tactics designed to shape perception and understanding. What's really groundbreaking is that Olson meticulously identified how these devices, when transposed to a musical setting, are more effective than others. He actually provided a framework for how composers can utilize these techniques to imbue their music with direct, impactful socio-political commentary, moving beyond just abstract expression into something more like tangible argument.
And this toolkit is where Olson's research really shines in its practical application for composers who want to engage directly with current events. Let's dive into some of these rhetorical devices and see how they actually manifest musically in his compositions. This gives you a really clear sense of how music can, well, speak to these issues.
Okay, let's hear them.
First up, we have allusion and intertextuality. This is all about direct or indirect references to external ideas, other works, cultural touchstones. It instantly activates your pre-existing associations as a listener and charges the music with layers of inherited meaning without needing a single word.
Gotcha. Examples.
Okay, in Olson's piece From Home, there's a movement called 3, Downloading The Sims 4. He creates a musical allusion to the popular life simulation game. In Barr's 2023, he playfully but pointedly inverts the bass line to represent the familiar Sims world thrown upside down during the COVID-19 lockdowns. It reflects that profound disruption and chaos in our own lives back then. It's a subtle nod, but it instantly connects you to that shared, very weird experience.
That's clever.
Isn't it? Another powerful example. The Anti-Masker. This piece directly comments on anti-mask sentiments during the pandemic. Here, Olson includes direct musical quotations from Rule Britannia right at the opening and anthem associated with British nationalism, Defiance. He also inserts a specific, almost mocking clarinet quotation later on. And furthermore, the narrator's direction in the score to apply war paint directly alludes to bombastic Brexit speeches, drawing this parallel between perceived freedoms and a disregard for collective health. It creates a subtle but pretty cutting political statement through both musical and textual reference.
Wow, okay. Layered.
Very. In Equals, which connects to the highly divisive 2020 U.S. election, Olson uses overt musical allusions. There's a violin motif in bars 32-34 that pointedly quotes Yankee Doodle, and then later, starting on beat 3 of bar 96, there's a clear quotation from the Star-Spangled Banner. By subtly weaving in these widely recognized national anthems, Olson doesn't just refer, he activates all your pre-existing associations with American identity, patriotism, the very foundations of the nation. It instantly charges the music with layers of meaning tied to that specific political climate.
Really potent.
Extremely. Then, in Summer, a piece reflecting on climate change, Olson employs structural and musical allusions of Vivaldi's iconic Lestate, Summer, from the Four Seasons. He mirrors its traditional fast, slow, fast tempo structure, uses Baroque ornamentation common in Vivaldi's time, and directly references Vivaldi's own musical depictions of birdsongs, winds, and storms. But he does it in a way that suggests the distortion and loss of natural summer rather than its beauty. A commentary through contrast.
Okay, next device.
Next is epanelepsis. This is a rhetorical device focused on powerful repetition, not just for emphasis, but to create a sense of continuity or even hyperbole exaggeration. In Olson's piece on Leaving You, about the UK's protracted departure from the EU, Brexit again, he uses the asynchronous repetition of a specific musical line 11 times. Now, this isn't just simple, direct repetition. The musical line repeats asynchronously, meaning it comes back slightly out of sync or with subtle variations each time. This technique, Olson says, allows for changes in musical inflections or delivery to be highlighted, much like a speaker might repeat a phrase with a different intonation to convey shifting emotions or emphasis. And the sheer number of repetitions, 11 times, creates this powerful sense of hyperbole. It makes the piece feel almost too long, drawn out, mirroring the protracted, seemingly endless nature of the Brexit process itself and maybe the public's exhaustion with it.
That's very evocative.
It is. And for Gaza, responding to the Middle East crisis, Olson uses repeated but subtly altered musical material. It's built with very close, often dissonant, major second intervals notes right next to each other, creating this tight, almost clashing sound. These are interspersed with conflicting interjections to powerfully represent sadness, desolation, the jarring reality of conflict. The insistent, slightly uncomfortable repetitions really draw you into a cycle of sorrow.
Heavy stuff. What else is in the toolkit?
Then we have exegesia and polyptoton. These focus on changing the inflection or delivery of similar ideas. Much like a speaker might rephrase a point multiple times to explore different facets or emphasize nuances. In Our Better History, written against the backdrop of disturbed politics in the USA leading up to the 2020 election, this piece for oboe and organ was actually commissioned for St. Paul's Cathedral in San Diego. It directly reflects on former President Obama's impactful political speech, Our Better History, mirroring his deliberate delivery and tone through musical phrasing. Olson noted that while it was musically successful in developing ideas and capturing the essence of the speech, it did somewhat limit his own intention and voice as a composer, which highlights that challenge of directly channeling someone else's rhetoric.
Interesting trade-off.
Yeah. And in an attack is taking place, Olson develops musical material by changing tenses, as he puts it, meaning he alters the instrument, the timbre, that unique quality of a sound, or the rhythm. He varies the delivery of similar musical lines across instruments. So, for example, a melodic phrase might first be played by a flute, light and airy, then by an oboe, more piercing, reedy, then by a clarinet, warmer, more rounded. As seen with the interplay between flute 1, oboe 1, and clarinet 1 in figures 19 and 20 of his score, this allows the composer to explore different interpretations of the same musical statement, just like a speaker would use different vocal inflections.
Next.
Hyperbole. This is emphatic exaggeration, blowing something out of proportion for dramatic effect. In Olson's Ghostlight, a piece for solo French horn, the composer intentionally uses the horn in non-traditional ways to create an exaggerated, almost surreal effect. The performer is actually asked to play the horn while simultaneously singing or humming a top melodic line, which you can see in bars 314.
Playing and singing at the same time on a horn.
Yeah. It creates this eerie, disembodied sound that isn't typically associated with the French horn at all. This technique creates an exaggerated, otherworldly effect. It plays on your perception of a single melodic line and really contributes to the metaphorical intent of the piece, perhaps trying to evoke or even ward away a ghostly presence with its strangely amplified sound. It's like the musical equivalent of shouting to make a point, but in a really weird way.
Fascinating. How about irony?
Irony. Conveying a meaning opposite to the literal, creating that sense of paradox or subtle critique. In From Home, the movement, I Am Aches, Daily Briefing, for tenor saxophone uses neurotic, ceaseless semiquavers, those very quick, persistent notes, punctuated by slap tongue and pensive silence. Now, slap tongue is a specific technique for wind instruments where the tongue literally slaps against the reed, creating a sharp, percussive attack. This incessant, almost agitated musical texture creates an ironic comment on the UK's generally slow and sluggish response to the pandemic. It implies this frantic yet ineffectual activity in contrast to the dire situation unfolding.
The music contradicts the title's implication of efficiency.
Exactly. In The Anti-Masker, irony is embedded right from the opening with that Rule Britannia quotation we mentioned, and it's further emphasized by a dramatic shift in texture and timbre later on that underpins a paradox where national pride is ironically linked to a seemingly unpatriotic refusal to protect one's community. Olson did reflect, though, that this piece was perhaps almost too literal in the conveyance of its political message, risking sounding preachy.
A fine line to walk.
Definitely. Then there's juxtaposition, placing contrasting elements side by side to highlight their differences or create tension. In Drift, which directly addresses climate change, Olson powerfully juxtaposes long musical lines, sustained, flowing melodies representing the Earth's long and mostly steady history, the slow processes of nature. These are contrasted sharply with short, disjunct percussive ideas, abrupt, disconnected, often harsh sounds, representing the sudden, unpredictable climate change effects, like extremes in weather or flash flooding. This musical friction, this clash between the old and the new, the stable and the chaotic, made Drift feel intuitively a more successful piece than On Leaving You for Olson, because that musical contrast immediately communicated the core message without needing any explanation. The music is the argument.
Makes sense, feeling the contrast.
Right. Next is metaphor. Applying a word or phrase to something not literally applicable, creating a symbolic representation where one thing stands for another. In Fragaza, the profound choice to use only a solo violin underpins this metaphor of a single human story amidst widespread devastation. The music's brevity, its musical interruptions, rests. Those periods of silence act as a powerful metaphor for shattered lives, the human sadness brought about by the destruction. The violin lines, Olson says, literally sigh, cry, and shout for help through their melodic contours and expressive dynamics, while remaining musically stuck in a devastated war zone by returning to similar unsettling musical phrases symbolizing entrapment and despair.
Incredibly poignant use of a single instrument.
It really is. And for Odaka's Taking Place, which explores the contemporary culture wars, the title itself is a metaphor taken from a Cold War-era film. He uses this historical reference to reflect on today's societal divisions. The piece creates a musical metaphor of two opposing and distinct voices, a progressive voice and a traditionalist voice engaged in a quasi-conversation or argument. This is often exaggerated by that Cold War context of mutually assured destruction, hinted at by the title. The piece's overall desolate tempo and sparse texture reflect the desolation and lack of progress of political discourse itself. The entire composition becomes this sonic landscape of modern division.
Wow, okay, nearly there.
Almost. Personification, attributing human characteristics or emotions to non-human things. In From Home, the movement Exo and Exange, Ventilator for accordion, is a powerful, poignant example. The accordion, Olson argues, is ideal for personification because its sound is physically produced by air being passed through the bellows, a direct parallel to human breathing.
Oh.
The opening air sounds directly mimic the mechanical, rhythmic breathing of a ventilator, a sound that became ubiquitous during the pandemic. Furthermore, long sustained notes personify the long, steady tones of hospital heart monitoring equipment, which you hear in bars 27-29. It creates this musical soundscape that evokes the hospital environment, the precariousness of life during the pandemic, giving human-like breath to a machine.
Chillingly effective.
And finally, the rule of three, presenting ideas in threes for emphasis, completeness, or creating a satisfying rhetorical structure. In Equals, Olson says this device is used more covertly in the composition, perhaps through subtle three-part phrasing or recurring motifs. But in An Attack is Taking Place, the overall structure of A1, BA2 feels apt for the culture wars. A1 represents the initial argument, B the counter-argument or contrasting perspective, and A2 the return to or restatement of the initial idea, often with slight variation. This common musical form mirrors the back and forth of a debate. It reflects how discussions often start and end in similar places and often have another voice arguing an opposing view. A perfect sonic metaphor for the often circular, polarized nature of contemporary culture wars.
That is an incredibly comprehensive toolkit. It really paints such a vivid picture of how meticulously Olson approached this research, actually formalizing how music can be used as this direct vehicle for commentary. And it's clear there's a profound impact to this work, not just academically, but personally too, right?
Absolutely.
For Olson himself, composing from home was described as a deeply cathartic experience. It served as his journal of the COVID pandemic, helping him explore that lockdown world around him and process the collective trauma we all felt. He also highlighted how the project fostered this real community of musicians, as each movement was composed specifically for individual friends and colleagues, allowing him to write directly to their strengths and personalities.
That's a lovely aspect of it.
Isn't it? And overall, the formalization of this toolkit, Olson suggests, fills a knowledge gap in the current research on referential and political music. It provides a practical methodology and, crucially, creates a bedrock for future research in this really burgeoning field.
It's a truly significant contribution, no doubt. This research powerfully reiterates the profound value of music for exploring non-musical ideas, whether it's through explicit rhetorical devices, as Olson has so brilliantly demonstrated, or through more abstract historical references like we saw with Andreessen or Vaughan Williams. It really empowers composers to engage directly with the world around them in a new, structured way. Now, while the current research had some limitations, for example, it didn't engage with audience surveying or observation. So we don't yet have direct data on how these musical techniques are actually received by listeners.
Right, the reception part is missing.
It has opened up fascinating future directions. For instance, Olson plans to collaborate directly with a librettist, a writer of text for musical works, to bridge composition and speech writing even further, seeing how that interdisciplinary work affects the use and impact of the toolkit. And this all raises, I think, an important question for all of us. If composers can so intentionally embed meaning and commentary, consciously shaping our understanding of real-world issues, how does that change our role as listeners? #outro.
What an incredible deep dive today. Seriously, tracing the sound of story, moving all the way from those purely experimental alien bleeps of early science fiction, right up to the precise, intentional political beats of contemporary classical music.
Quite a journey.
It really is. We started with the truly experimental sounds of Forbidden Planet, a film that astonishingly predated iconic electronic music acts and just perfectly captured the spirit of the 1950s space race with its unsettling bleeps, whirring, haunting alien noises making sound itself a character.
Groundbreaking stuff.
Then we explored Tucker's fascinating metaphor of film music as architecture, understanding how music isn't just an add-on, but how it intricately designs and shapes the very feeling and narrative within that cinematic space. How changing the music can literally change the story, even if it's non-diegetic, completely non-visual.
But that invisible influence.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
finally, we delved into these contemporary classical composers like Nicholas Olson, who are now skilled rhetoricians, crafting these intricate musical arguments about the most pressing socio-political issues of our time, from climate change to culture wars, using a precise toolkit of rhetorical devices transposed directly into music. It's just such a powerful reminder that music is not just entertainment, not just background noise. It's a profound, adaptable, and surprisingly direct language that can surprise you, inform you, and move you in ways you might never have consciously realized before.
And if we connect all this to the bigger picture, it really can profoundly reshape how we might engage with any music we encounter in our daily lives.
So,
It's on the radio, or maybe a complex classical composition. Maybe take a moment. Consider what room it's inviting you into. What emotions and narratives is its sonic architecture subtly building around you. Pay attention maybe to what rhetorical devices it might be subtly employing to sway your emotions or your understanding. Is there a repeated phrase, a sudden shift in texture, a familiar musical snippet being used ironically? Ask yourself what hidden stories, what unspoken arguments, or what cultural sentiments it might be trying to tell you beyond just the notes themselves. How does this deeper, maybe more critical understanding change your relationship with the sounds that are all around you? And what new insights might you uncover by just listening with fresh, informed ears?